Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of Work Life Everything, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for making time out of your busy day to join us. If you are new to Work Life Everything, which likely many of you are, I'd like to just give you a little bit of background on that before we get started. My name is Haley Swenson. I'm a PhD social scientist and a longtime researcher and writer focused on intersectional gender equality, especially focused on the connection between inequality at work and inequality at home. That's kind of one of my favorite areas of study. And today we're joined by two other experts, Shaniqua Bradley and Nicole Rodgers, and I'll introduce them more formally in just a moment. I wanted to set the stage by giving a bit of background about who we are and why we are doing this event today. I co-founded Work Life Everything with a couple of people about 2 years ago. And those people are Leah Ruppiner, who is a professor at the University of Melbourne, a sociologist, and I would say one of the foremost thinkers on the mental load. She's actually in the midst of pretty groundbreaking research in attempting to give a real objective, measurable definition of the mental load so we can actually compare different people's mental loads. And I'll cite some of her research today in this discussion. Secondly, we co-founded with Lauren Berry, who is a corporate social change expert. Her background has mostly been in the energy sector, but she has been really fascinated by, in that sector in particular, the real steep decline in women as you get into the higher ranks of leadership. And so she's also been asking a lot of questions around gender. What we hope to do when we founded Work Life Everything is close what we saw as a gap between, on the one hand, research, a lot of it being done by academics, some think tanks and other spaces, and a lot of knowledge we were gaining about how gender inequality is playing out, how it plays out in real time at a sociological level, et cetera. And then on the other hand, people who were trying to solve these problems in practical ways, either in their own households, in their own workplaces, even for policymakers, for innovators and entrepreneurs. And sometimes that research just wasn't making its way to them. So we wanted to close that gap. One of the biggest gaps that we identified is this question of the mental load. What is the mental load? Many people are increasingly familiar with it. Maybe you read the Emma comics about the mental load. You might hear it. You and your girlfriends might talk about it when you're talking about your own families, your own relationships. It's coming up again and again. At Work Life Everything, we use a definition that's actually generated through Leah Reppiner's research with Liz Dean. And it is essentially the combination of both cognitive and emotional labor that it takes to get you and those you care for through both the short term and the long term of life. So there's a really big definition, and I think it really represents what the mental load is. It's purposely big because it's trying to describe everything that it is that weighs on a person in the course of a day. And when I say a person, I do mean it could be everybody. I think everybody carries a mental load, but we know that women in particular, because of their role in caregiving, are carrying the heaviest mental load. And research has certainly backed that up. Leah's definition that she came to with her colleagues also identified a few other things through interviews with people about what it is that makes the mental load so particularly heavy, so particularly significant in their lives. And there's three factors I want to put out here that will kind of guide our discussion as we think about the mental load in single mothers. One, that it is invisible. And it's actually a really interesting concept because the better you are at carrying a mental load and solving those problems, in some ways, the more invisible it is to those around you. It can be a little bit harder for people to see that you're doing all this work, especially if you're doing it really efficiently. So it's problematic often in terms of that. When people are trying to establish a fair mental load, that can be really difficult if you actually can't see or even detect what that mental load is like for people. Secondly, it's boundaryless. So the mental load does not respect the difference between work and home and play. You might be on the beach trying to have a nice, relaxing time, and your mental load is going to creep in, right? That could be your mental load for your work. It could be your mental load for your family life, the logistics of parenting, of elder care. So there are no boundaries when it comes to the mental load, and that can cause people a lot of stress. And the third factor they identified is that it's enduring. You never reach a point where you've sort of finished your mental load, where you've checked everything off your list. And in fact, when you solve one problem in your mental load, sometimes that just creates a whole new one or a whole new series of questions that your mind is trying to tackle. So I might, for example, figure out how to get my 1-year-old to sleep through the night. Still working on it. It's been a journey his whole life to try to do that. And as we come up with one sleep system, it might create new kinds of pitfalls, right? If I really nail down his napping, then suddenly he's not sleeping as long, and then we're getting up at 5 a.m. And so it doesn't really feel like he's sleeping through the night anyway. So it's invisible, boundaryless, and enduring. There's been an explosion of interest in this topic in recent years. As I said, there's comics about it. It's getting brought up in popular articles, in pop culture even. It's a buzzword that you hear around. And there is research on it as well, increasingly, not just from Leah, but other sociologists as well. And I think we're hearing sort of across disciplines more and more interest in this topic. And so we want to help pursue greater research on this subject, find out exactly how different people are understanding it. Because one of the issues we've identified, and this is one of these gaps, is that for the most part, the way the mental load is being taken up is as an issue between heterosexual partners, usually married partners within a household. And the real question is, how can we better share that mental load? And this is a huge question, and one that at Work Life Everything, we're also really interested in solving. But that's not even sort of the half of it when it comes to our general cultural experience of the mental load. There are so many other questions to answer. So, for example, what about other couples? What about queer couples? I myself am married to a woman. Less is known about how it is that we navigate the mental load, or say how that compares with two men in a relationship, or with trans and non-binary people who are sort of rejecting these traditional gender scripts altogether. There are other questions. How does the mental load differ for working class parents versus upper middle class parents, professional parents? What does it mean to be able to attend to life while you're at work versus when you're at work, maybe you're on a factory line or a retail floor, you can't do that. So tons and tons of questions. And we think one of the most urgent questions, and this is really the reason for today, is how do single moms handle the mental load when there's not necessarily another partner directly in the home that can share this work with? Who are they sharing it with, if anybody? And what are they doing when it comes down to it and there's just nobody to be sharing it with, and it's really all falling on them? So in some ways, this is one of the most urgent questions around the mental load. And I think the other issue is not just the magnitude at which single parents experience this, but if we could solve the problem for single parents, what would that mean for everybody? And so this is one of the questions we'll tackle today. I think Shaniqua and Nicole will both have some thoughts on that question. So as we talk about single moms, I just want to lay out, just as I did for the mental load, kind of a few basic factors that the research signals to us about single moms. So one, single motherhood is extremely common. In fact, there are more children, a greater percentage of children living with single moms in the United States than any other country in the world. Recent figures, about 14 million kids are living with single moms. That number sort of really rose up over the last 30 years. It's really plateaued. And, this is a really fluid definition as well. That's something sometimes people don't appreciate. That a single mom might be somebody who was married when they had a child and is now divorced. They might have participation from a child's father or other parent to some degree, though they might not be in the house with them. Somebody might be a single parent at one time and then not for the entire course of the child's life. There are just many, many factors in what makes a single mom. And that's one of the things that is changing rapidly. I should also say this might include people who aren't the biological parent of a child. This could be somebody who's taken on the role of parent for a relative. So we really have to think broadly when we think about this category of single parent and not try to pigeonhole it to one type of parent with one type of experience. So we're going to be trying to generate some common understanding of what this experience is like, but we want to really preface and say this is a really diverse and broad category and not go too far in that generalization. Thirdly, I want to say that this category of single mom is one that is incredibly stigmatized. There may be factors about single motherhood that make it especially difficult that might just be from the fact that there's one parent trying to do a lot of things. But a lot of what single mothers are facing is not just something that's inherent to the experience of being a single mom, but is actually being brought about by the way society is treating single moms. So there is recent polling, and I think our panelists will have some more insight on this, that shows only about 60% of Americans say a parent raising a child on their own is acceptable. Just a little more than half. Versus if you ask the American public, is it acceptable for two parents to raise a child together? It's like 93% that say, yes, that's acceptable. So we want to, as we're having this conversation, try to disentangle a little bit of fact from fiction about single moms, and think as well about how bias itself is becoming part of the mental load that single moms are facing. That is, that it's not just about what's sort of within the household, within their family dynamic, but also from things that are external to it that might be causing more of that stress, that heaviness that we think about when we talk about the mental load. So with that, I've talked long enough here. I want to dive right into our panel. So I'm going to start things with Shaniqua Bradley. Shaniqua is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Work and Child Advocacy at Montclair State University, which is in New Jersey. She is a qualitative researcher, a licensed clinical social worker, a certified clinical social worker supervisor, and a certified school social worker. That's many hats. I think Shaniqua could tell us about her mental load as well. Shaniqua considers herself to be an applied scientist with a strong focus on generating research that will be used to assist in developing programs and services for underserved, disadvantaged inner city communities. In addition to being an educator and mentor for students, Shaniqua remains connected to clinical practice work and serves as a per diem therapist for Family and Children's Services Incorporated of New Jersey. She also, and we always want to bring in a little of the play side of things when we can, loves the beach and enjoys going to Broadway shows. So this is the whole person, Shaniqua Bradley. Shaniqua, you have studied single moms who are navigating the school system with children with special needs. And I know you've revisited that research since the pandemic to see how things have changed. So you're one of the few researchers out there that we have identified who has explicitly focused on single moms and stress. So we really want to hear from you. And I'll say, if there are researchers joining us today and you're like, hey, I've also done this, add your work into the chat. We'd love to bring it in. This will be a chance for all of us to learn from you as well. So Shaniqua, why don't you kick things off for us? Tell us a little bit about what you found, about the study that you've done and what you've heard from single moms.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Haley, and the opportunity to be here and be in this space. Just to kind of give some quick background history, my interest in single moms or single parents population really kind of spurred from two areas. So one, my personal lived experience. So growing up in a single parent household where my mom raised my sister and I. So having an understanding of some of the challenges and the struggles and even seeing the resilience and the strength of my mom. And so having some understanding of what some of the needs of that population, what that looks like. And then when I started working in the school system, I worked majority with youth who came from single parent families. And I worked in inner city, low income communities. And I got the opportunity to work with students who had IEPs. So they were enrolled in special education services in schools. And quite naturally, they struggled with various areas. And so just seeing the responses of the school, what were we doing to actually help the students, as well as the parents, right? And that really kind of spurred my interest in this area and to do some research and see, well, what's out there? What has been studied for this area? And there wasn't much, to my knowledge, there wasn't much, especially because I really honed in on single mothers who were parenting an adolescent who had special education services in school, and there were some struggles. So it could have been an academic struggle, a social struggle, maybe some emotional or mental health challenges. So what was that experience like? That's really what spurred it. And then what supports were available, not just to the youth, but also to these parents, who are parenting these adolescents. And so that really kind of spearheaded and started like, what's out there? What do we do? Because we can't just, keep recommending disciplinary actions or consequences that are not going to be that really are harmful to the youth and ultimately the parents too. So my original study that I started with was in 2019 before the pandemic. And I recruited single mothers who were raising an adolescent who was enrolled in special education services in school, and engaging in some sort of risk. So there was a screening form and we kind of went through the different categories of risk. So they identified at least one risk that they saw with their adolescent. And so really the focus was to understand what are the lived experiences of these parents. What is it like to be a single mother, and to be a single mother of an adolescent who has a disability, and navigating just that process in school. And then the other piece that I really was interested in, wanted to know more about, was what can schools do better? Like, what are schools doing, to help you? And then what can they do better? And so from hearing from the parents, it was such an eye-opening experience. The data just revealed so much. And really, these parents are so strong. They're resilient, and just really helping me to see like what types of supports the parents really needed. And so some of the things that really came out from the data, really just this need to collaborate, that schools aren't doing this with parents. They're not collaborating. It's more like a power dynamic where it's a top-down approach. They're not being invited to meetings. They're being sent a letter and said, here's when your child's meeting is. And it's not accommodating their work schedules or, other demands that they have. There's a lack of resources, that was present. There's not enough resources for the youth. The parents felt that was in schools, and also with regard to school personnel being a resource. Do we have enough staff available to assist the kids with some of the struggles and challenges that they need, as well as the parents, because the parents need support too. And so I decided to do a follow-up study after the pandemic to see, well, has things changed? Because schools did start to implement some new things, especially with mental health resources after the pandemic. So I wanted to find out, well, was there an increase in supports? What did that look like? And sadly, there hasn't been as much of an increase as as it should be. So parents are still struggling to collaborate, with schools. They still feel that schools don't communicate with them like they should. Especially, it's especially important when their child does have a disability and there are concerns and challenges that they need help with, because it's a heavy load. Just knowing that your child has a disability or a diagnosis and they have certain struggles, and how to navigate that process and have the supports, that is still something that I've seen in my research that is still, still a struggle and a challenge, when we talk about this population. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Shaniqua. And I want to hear some more about this as well. I mean, especially the way that the women you interviewed are experiencing this stress and what they're doing with it in the absence of the support that we might hope they're getting from schools. But I want to kind of zoom out for a second and bring Nicole in. Nicole Rodgers, thank you for joining us. Nicole is the founder and executive director of Family Story, an organization founded in 2015 to address and dismantle family privilege in America and create cultural and political strategies to advance equity for all types of families. Nicole is an entrepreneur, an author, a futurist, in parentheses, she says sometimes a futurist, so maybe we'll hear about that, and an expert on the changing family who specializes in communications and research in the public interest. So Nicole, I'm really curious about what comes up for you as you've listened to my intro, and then Shaniqua talking about her specific research. So much of your career has been about challenging the stories we tell ourselves about the American family. What makes a good family, what responsibility we have to them, what causes a family's decline. How are single moms coming up in this? How are we misreading them, the role that they're playing, their families and what they need? What are we missing?
Thank you for having me, Haley, and great to be with you, Shaniqua, too. There's a lot of ways to answer that. I think I'll start with some research that I did on sort of narratives around single mothers. One thing that's sort of clear to me is that single mothers really don't want to be obviously stigmatized, but they don't want to be seen as sort of pitiable or less than. That's not actually that's sometimes sort of what we think of that we're benevolently doing. There we go. But we're not being really benevolent when we sort of pity single mothers. At least that's not how they feel about it. And I think what a lot of single mothers really want people to understand is, even if they didn't set out to be single moms, their situations are often preferable to whatever the alternative is or was, right? So we sort of treat it as like, well, this is suboptimal, but is it actually suboptimal? Like maybe they were in a relationship with another adult um, that was dangerous. Maybe it was just plain, maybe it was just plain unhappy for them and causing their mental health to suffer. Maybe it was but in any case, being without that person and being a single parent is actually preferable to them. It's the same thing we hear, from the people who are considered themselves single mothers by choice. They didn't always, not, a lot of them didn't set out to be single mothers by choice, but they consider it very much preferable to the alternative. They didn't want to miss the opportunity to be parents. So I think one thing to start with is just this idea that, I personally see single mothers as like superheroes, but what we definitely should not do is think that we're being good to them or benevolent by pitying them. I think that's actually not sort of the right strategy or approach. And then I think it's worth saying also that just thinking about mental load, um, adding another parent obviously does not necessarily solve the mental load. And we know that because we know that there's such a discrepancy in mental load in terms of heterosexual couples. So we know that moms tend to carry the mental load even in couples with two parents. So this idea that somehow the problems of single parents and mental load are ones that actually can be solved with another, if you were to somehow be able to magically add a married partner, that's actually not the case. And it's actually sort of interesting. It leads us to sort of explore, I think, more creative options for thinking about mental load. And, I'd like to bring in too, sort of one of my favorite statistics here that I know the three of us have discussed. But, we know, for example, that single mothers do less housework than their married or partnered peers. And that is, to me, a really interesting statistic for a variety of reasons. And it doesn't necessarily tell us about mental load, but it suggests that without a partner present, standards do change for people in terms of how they see what they need to keep up. Maybe mental load is lightened in a way, potentially. Maybe you become the kind of person that says, you know what, it's okay if I miss this thing for my school one day. It's not the end of the world. My child will survive it. And I'm not going to take on, the burden of sort of being the perfect parent in every way in that space, etc. So that's sort of a few things I wanted to bring in initially. And I'll turn it back to you, Haley, because I know there's a lot more to discuss, but those are the things that are coming up for me when we think about single parenthood and single mothers particularly.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I mean, I think those are just fantastic points, and it's kind of easy. I think, especially when I talked about before this, the way in which almost all of the mental load conversation we're having culturally focuses on heterosexual married couples, and it's sort of treated that there's this fixed mental load capacity or amount, right? That there's just always going to be this much mental load, and then the question is, how do you share it between the two people? But I think that statistic about the housework, right? That single moms or divorced women are doing less housework than married moms says actually maybe that other person is bringing in more work. And this isn't to say necessarily that means, we discard them or, that that's the easier solution. But it does make us ask, when we look at somebody like a single mother, first of all, we shouldn't assume anything actually about their experience of the mental load. And it's I think important that we think about, as you said, the many different reasons somebody might be a single parent, and that often this is the better alternative to something else, right? And maybe it's a situation in which they were carrying the mental load already, right? Almost as a single parent, even though they were, say, married before, with a partner before, and that the mental load might be expanded when you bring a partner in. I mean, another way that I've thought about this as well, in my experience as a queer woman, because my wife and I, both gendered as women, both tend to really take the lead on mental load. And it actually means that we have very long discussions when it comes to making a decision about how to do that, about what to do, about where to go. And it's not to say that, you know, we don't appreciate that feedback, but it just changes the experience of it. So I think that sort of this message of just like, don't assume, right? And certainly don't pity, because it's not as simple as we might think that it is. I was also really interested in a statistic that I saw when I was looking at Pew's research on the changing family, that it is true that Americans tend to say now, more Americans tend to say they think people probably stay in bad marriages too long, rather than that they're leaving marriages too fast or without putting in the effort. So there is a little bit of a change on this front. And I think people are increasingly starting to see some of those points that you were raising, Nicole. Shaniqua, if we can go back to you for a moment, just following up on this thread of like the mental load sometimes comes from things outside of us. Institutions are really important to that, that institutions are developing a mental load. I mean, as we've interviewed people about their mental load, so much of it is about, you know, the school system giving out information that's like this unorganized flood, and they spend so much time just organizing it, or that there's like 6 different apps they have to use to interact with their kids' schools. I'm wondering if you can give some kind of specifics about what the moms you were interviewing were saying to you about the schools, and what would make their lives easier, right? I think way too often we hear these discussions about single moms and it's like, just get a partner, right? Don't be a single mom is the solution. And that is just not reasonable and not practical. So what are you hearing from single moms about what really would be practical, or certainly about what would lighten the load on their end?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely the moms they're invested in the well-being of their child. You know, they understand that they may have to do a little bit more because their child has a disability, and there's different struggles and challenges that their child may encounter. They understand that maybe they have to seek out different supports and resources because of the nature of the child's disability. But what really came up a lot in the original study, as well as in the follow-up study, is that schools just aren't sharing the information, or they're kind of, here, read this book, but we're not explaining to you what it is. And so parents really were looking for this really like supportive partnership where, okay, you're providing me with resources, you're explaining this to me. How is it going to help me? How is it going to help my child? How do I go about getting access to these resources? So I don't know, you know, how many are familiar with the special education process, and it looks a little bit different in each state. So there is federal legislation that outlines, guidelines that set forth for special education, but then each state then has its own specific like mandates and how they carry it out. And so one of the things the parents often discuss was getting the little book. And so the little book that they get when they have the meetings, and the book it's not thick, but it's very tiny. It's full of words, full of law. Right. So if you're not familiar with law, you're not going to understand it. And so things like that they said, you know, okay, you're giving me this book, but you're not really explaining this to me. Like, what does this mean? You're not telling me about services and programs that could be beneficial to me and or my child. And so really wanting that collaboration with schools to kind of walk them through the process. I'm willing to do the work. I just need to know, what do I need to do to get there to help my child and ultimately help me. So that's what came up a lot from parents, in terms of the types of supports that they needed.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing there, I mean, honestly, if the institutions were a little more user friendly, right? Like in technology, we hear about UX research all the time. What's the user experience? Apps are being designed for the user. You know, what about institutions, right? What if rethought our institutions as being built for the user experience, and what if that user experience didn't assume that there were two parents in the home, that one of the parents may not be employed? I mean, this is something I hear a lot from working moms, whether they're single moms or not, that often the schools seem to act as though there's a parent just available at all times of the day. And so when you think about if we designed for that user experience, it would actually make the experience so much better for everybody. I mean, I can't imagine that any parent wants to be asked to do this kind of background research, this complex legal reading, without somebody kind of designing the process for them. And I think this is probably a big takeaway on the mental load in general is institutionally, instead of institutions just kind of focusing on the child and then leaving the parent to catch up, what if they thought about the child and the parent together, right? And that as you're solving and approaching these problems, you're solving it for both of them. There's something I wanted to follow up on in Nicole's research as well that ties into this, and I think it's this myth maybe that single moms are doing it alone. Certainly, by definition, there's a sense of solo parenting happening here. They're not doing it with a romantic partner who is also the child's parent, but that is a myth. Am I right, Nicole? And what have you found on this about single moms and who they're leaning on when they get faced with, say, this onslaught of information or a huge to-do list? Are they doing it alone? And if not, where are they turning?
Yeah. The answer is it varies completely. So there are definitely people who are single moms who are more isolated, and really are carrying all the burden. And there's definitely single mothers that have huge communities. And as far as I know, there's not actually a great deal of research that really looks at sort of the differences in sort of how people come to those different kinds of networks where they are able to, how they build. But we do know a couple things that are really interesting. And one of them, which I feel like gets lost sort of a lot in these conversations, is that Black families are particularly good at actually sharing caregiving across children, or sort of across families when it comes to children. And that's just because there's naturally more of these kinship models where people who are both biological and non-biological play roles that mirror biological roles, and where there's more responsibilities. And so when you actually look at Black single mothers, who tend to be the most stigmatized, and we still sort of hold on decades later to these sort of terrible welfare queen kind of stereotypes from kind of the Reagan years, one of the things that's sort of ironic is actually that Black families have done, you could argue that they've done the best job at really building community around them to help care for children when it comes to single parents. You're not going to meet many Black families where there's not aunties involved, where there's not other kin involved who are actively taking a role in caring for children, who are picking them up from school sometimes, who know their routines, who have close family-like relationships with them. And so I think that's just one thing to kind of point out in the larger spectrum of kind of community, is that there are actually places where you find great community for single mothers. And in some ways, you could say that a lot of Black families are sort of the trailblazers in this way, and that we could all sort of learn something from them about how to build community around single parenthood and around single mothers.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it reminds me of an interview that I did with the researcher LaShonda Pittman recently, who wrote a book called Grandmothering While Black. And she focuses on the experience of Black grandmothers who've unexpectedly taken on the role of parent, essentially, to their grandchildren. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Many have to do with some of the things we've already mentioned, or that have been in the background of this conversation, like welfare reform, like child protective services playing an increasing policing role over Black families. And she points out that they have this kinship model, this expected intensive grandmothering role that was already there. It's like the question is not, will people step up? Will people want to help? Will people want to, be a part of the community that parents these children? The issue that that Dr. Pittman identifies is the institutions are not ready for that. So these grandmas are taking on this mothering role without legal rights, without financial rights to these kids, and that is an incredible mental load. I mean, she really goes through in painstaking detail the legal factors they have to consider, the financial factors they have to consider, and how they have to make really tough decisions about things like formal custody in order to do this. So there's just this gap between, really what the experience of American families is like today in all its diversity and its fluidity and its communal nature, which I think we all celebrate and want more of, and then the way institutions are or are not, set up for that. Shaniqua, I'm wondering if anything comes to mind from you here. And I want to encourage folks now, if you have a moment to put a comment in, ask a question. If we get questions, we'll try to take them on before we wrap up. If anything here has been particularly useful or illuminating, or has resonated with you, please let us know. Drop those in the comments now. But I want to start pointing us a little bit towards solutions. I think we've explored both the challenges and sort of just the unique features of the mental load for single moms so far. Shaniqua, what comes to mind first and foremost when it comes to making things better?
Yeah. First, I just want to, Nicole, I really appreciate just what you mentioned about Black families being the trailblazers and, essentially having a lot to learn in terms of how, the community aspect and how they build community with their families. It just really resonated with me, with my participants, because they all were Black mothers, African-American mothers. And some of the things that they spoke to me about, specifically some of the challenges and barriers that they face were because they were a Black mother, they were African-American mother, and how they were viewed, how they were talked to, how they were disrespected, how they were looked at differently because of who they are, right? The minute they walked in the door, these automatic assumptions and stigmas were there from the get-go, and it kind of just posed a challenge from the beginning. And they often, question, would this have been this way if I wasn't a Black woman? If it was another single mother coming in, would they have been treated this way? Would they have been talked to this way? Would their child have gotten the services that they actually need? So I thank you for bringing that up, and I appreciate that. So moving into solutions and where do we go? Where do we start? I mean, I think for me, one of the biggest things I think is the educational system, because the children are spending a significant amount of time there. If we just think about 7 days out of a week, 5 days they're in school, 12 months out of a year, 10 months they're in school. So it is a big part of their lives and their parents' lives. And, parents are sending their children to school, trusting that the school is gonna, be the safe place for their child and provide the necessary resources and supports. And so what can we do? What type of programming and services can be implemented in schools to help both parents and the youth? And then I think the other piece is recognizing that schools can't do everything. It can't be a one-stop shop. So where do we go from there? We go to the communities. What are the agencies and the organizations doing within the communities? Can they, make access to some of these services and supports for families? The colleges and the universities, can they offer some of this programming on their campuses? And really that these services and programs are accessible, that it's within the community of the parents, so that they're not having to travel an hour to get to a service, that the services are affordable, and that they're available at times that parents can actually take the kid. So do we have programming available evening, weekends, when parents can go and can attend? And so those are some of the things that I think, where we could easily start by implementing stuff within schools and communities that would be a big help and relief to the single moms.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are all fantastic starting points. And what they kind of assume is as a prerequisite to making things better is that we just assume that, you know, that single moms are out there and that our systems have to be built to accommodating them. I think too often our institutions are still acting like single moms are just this rare exception, rather than, you know, something like 20% of households, you know, with children are single mom headed. So to just assume that this is just a part of the life, and then once we design for them, like I said before, then we're designing in a way that actually makes things easier for everybody, you know, including dual working families, you know, that might have two parents in the home. Nicole, what comes to mind for you when you think about solutions?
Well, I would say, first of all, I think it's interesting. We've done a bunch of research with both single mothers and unmarried mothers, and you know, women basically agreed that children do best with multiple adults invested in their well-being, but really understand that it's not important that those necessarily are two married parents. And the other interesting thing we found in that research is that women said that they would like more ways to raise children with someone who is not a romantic partner. And a solid majority of unmarried mothers actually said they would consider raising a child with someone who's not a romantic partner. So that's just to say the interest is there. This is not a solution without a problem. This is people saying, I'd actually like help in this way. And I think what it comes back to is, I mean, there's sort of a couple different levels of solutions. On the sort of more individual level, like, people are in their own ways doing this trailblazing and building community with people who are not romantic partners, and giving them more explicit roles when it comes to their children. So I think that, you know, we've always had sort of godparents, but like, how can we formalize the auntie relationship? How can we formalize, and I don't mean formalize in a way that makes it sort of, that can sound sort of bureaucratic, but I mean, make it as important as it really is, and make it show up in the ways where it is important, so that, and actually I thought of, Shaniqua, some stuff I've just heard about schools doing that's so interesting to me, like schools that don't ask for daycare centers that don't ask, you know, who are your mom and dad. They ask, who are your grown-ups? And your grown-ups can include auntie. Grown-ups don't have to be mom or dad. It doesn't make an assumption about who those people are. But even in a way that you interact with families by not actually prescribing for them who the important people are, is a very, very important step, I think, and one that we forget. It's a small and easy step, and it's one that really helps us sort of broaden the network of people who can be considered both important and have actual responsibility within a child's life. Like, why does a mom or dad have to be the one to show up to a school meeting if there is another adult involved in the child's life who is invested in their well-being? There's no great reason for that. So I think there's things like that, and there's building communities, and there's sort of thinking again about what I talked about, which is sort of the trailblazing of Black families, and sort of understanding that there's already models we can look to actually expand on, for white people to actually think about as real tried and true, tested out models. And then there's also the bigger picture that so many of us and people we know are working on, which is the big structural changes. Like, we absolutely, like, the mental load would be massively decreased if we had things like paid family leave. It would be massively decreased if we had things like easily accessible and affordable, you know, childcare. It would be massively decreased if we had things like Medicare for all, or some other healthcare system that wasn't so onerous. So, you know, these are big structural things that actually ultimately reduce mental load. And I know, Haley, you know, you and I have spoken about sort of looking at and wondering, you know, do countries that really do a good job of, do have really strong welfare states, like, is mental load decreased? And, you know, we don't know the answer to that as far as I know, but I would put a lot of money on yes. I think that's a good bet. And I think you can sort of make an assumption that in places where some of those basics are taken care of, you're lightening people's loads.
Yeah, and we do have country by country analyses of happiness. And I'll tell you, the United States is not high up on that list,
Right.
especially when it comes to parents' general happiness. These connections haven't been made formally in the research yet, at least that we know of. And like I said, please share more research with us. But I think that's right on. We can make a few kinds of guesses, hypotheses about what's going on here. And I think that's right. I mean, as I said before, I'm doing parenting with my wife, and we both take on a great mental load. But there are questions like, childcare that eat up so much of our time, our energy, our worry. It's not just about where our son is and is he being taken care of, but about, can we afford it? How many more hours do we need to work to make up for the hour of childcare? These kinds of calculations that are being done. And I think, if we lived, say, in Quebec, where childcare is, you're guaranteed a spot and it's $10 a day, right? What does that do to your mental load to just know? And then you can worry about the other things, right? I've got a spot and it's $10 a day. And now I can worry about, is it close to my workplace? Is it making him happy? Is he making friends there? Are the teachers the people that I like? I think all of those kinds of questions we could focus more on. And I'm sure it does tie into happiness. So I think I'll just sort of kind of close us out here with a few thoughts on the agenda for Work Life Everything moving forward. And we invite people to help us with this. We're at early stages. We're looking for people to partner with when it comes to research. We're looking for families to talk about their experiences with us so we can develop that broader, bigger, bolder understanding of these concepts. But so much of the mental load focus just sort of goes straight into the household and treats the mental load, as I said before, like it's this fixed thing that we can't really do anything to change or shift. And I think it's so important to think about that mental load as sort of being brought in by all these external forces, policy, economics, workplaces, schools, and instead start thinking about what we want our experience of parenting, of caregiving to look like. And then think about how we need to remake those institutions to make that clear. So these are some studies that we want to do. What is the mental load of getting childcare or paid parental leave look like in the United States for a parent versus in other countries, or even in states that have done a little bit better on this front, so we can actually substantiate that. I also think it's really important that we start being able to talk about what the cost is of a heavy mental load. I mean, we know that it doesn't feel good, right? That it eats away at your time. But what about its impact on our bodies, on our mental health? I think, rates of anxiety and depression among single moms is something that we should all be really concerned about and thinking about how to make better. We just have to get outside this notion that this is an individual problem that needs individual solutions. When we start looking at patterns, it's really clear here that there's something bigger going on. So there's just a million questions we want to answer. And I hope this conversation will be the first of many in trying to push this conversation forward. Our hope is that we can become a bit of a hub for conversations about the mental load. And I think this piece on single parents is just a fantastic first start to that. So I want to thank Shaniqua and Nicole for both of their incredible expertise and their experience in research, and as people out in the world who are going through these things and talking to others about them as well, and helping us really develop a thorough understanding of the mental load as it operates in this very diverse, unequal world that we're in. So thank you so much for joining us. We're happy to take questions and comments afterward, and we're going to make sure this conversation lives on, that it's posted both at Work Life Everything's website, and that we can hopefully generate some research and some answers to questions out of this. One of my hopes is actually to put out a survey to single mothers so we can help understand their mental load a bit better after this. So if you're interested in any of this, please follow us on our LinkedIn page if you're not already. If you go to Work Life Everything, you can sign up to our email list, and we'd be happy to continue to bring you into this conversation. I want to thank you all so very much. Have a wonderful Thursday afternoon, and good luck out there with your own mental load. I hope some of this was really useful to you. Thank you.